Today is March 31st, 2019. My name is Brittany Mendez, and I'm interviewing Diana Gutierrez Fernandez for the Voces Oral History Project. We are currently sitting in the Texas A&M Corpus Christi College campus. Ms. Fernandez, thank you for sharing your story with us. As we have already explained, your interview will be housed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American collection. Please know that if there's anything you do not wish to talk about, you do not have to. And if there's anything you do want to talk about that I do not ask, please feel free to interject. Okay, let's get started. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up in Corpus Christi?
I grew up in a new neighborhood my parents had moved into right after they got married. I was born in 1950. And it was a very integrated neighborhood. It was actually designed to serve the people who were living on the base as part of the Navy base. And there was a local Catholic church and school, Christ the King, and that was kind of the center of that little community. So all the children on the block, we played outside all the time. We walked to school. Most of us attended Christ the King Elementary School or the public school, Travis. And it was really a wonderful place to grow up in. So I have very good, fond memories and still maintain some contact with some of the people in the neighborhood.
Your parents are part of the World War II generation. How did that shape your childhood and your mindset?
I think it was very interesting. Even though they were born here in the United States, my grandparents had come from Mexico, but they really embraced this life. They worked hard. They believed. They became, middle class. They had a path to middle class. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad worked with a railroad. And so I think that experience, even though my dad was unable to participate in World War II because of his eyesight, he was part of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration under FDR, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, which built parks and infrastructure for the state. That's still standing today. And so he worked that area since he couldn't. He did that public service since he couldn't be in the military. And I think that shaped, he had a love for the country. They assimilated. And it also was interesting as we got into the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. It created some kind of a little bit of a clash, but we had interesting discussions. But it was a great place to grow up in, and I think their World War II experience and being teenagers during the Depression made them especially grateful and careful with their money through the years.
And sorry to interrupt. I think that I have.
Your parents are part of the World War II generation. How did that shape your childhood and your mindset growing up?
I think it shaped a lot because they were teenagers in the Depression, and then when World War II came along, my dad was unable to participate in the military service because of it. He had very poor eyesight, so he didn't qualify. But he chose to become part of the Works Progress Administration under Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he worked in what was called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which built infrastructure across the country. And mostly where you see it is like in the state parks. So a lot of the buildings and developments of the parks was done by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that's what he did. And he was very hard worker, my parents believed, embraced this country, even though they had not been born in this country. I mean, they were born in this country. Their parents had not been born in this country. They were born in Corpus, and they embraced the American way. They were grateful. They worked very hard. My dad was a successful employer in the Texas-Mexican Railroad. My mom was a homemaker all her life. And they were really what I would call middle class. They attained middle class and were frugal in a way, I think, because of their experience with the Depression. So they were able to live a comfortable life and save money at the same time, and had successful careers, both of them.
The last time I spoke to you, you had mentioned that your mother, Beatriz Blanca Campos, was very sympathetic and influenced you in certain ways. How so?
Well, she was interesting because she did not finish high school as my father did, but my mother was pulled out of school in 9th grade because to work with a family, they had a panaderia. And so she was kind of resentful that she didn't get to finish school, but she was very aware of injustices, and I would go with her like to the store or something, And if somebody was being treated badly in line, she would step up and, be the voice for them, or she'd march back to the store and complain about this and that. We always made fun of, you earned your stripes today. You fought somebody. But yeah, she was, it taught me to kind of stand up for myself, and not be afraid to, defend yourself. So even though she didn't have formal schooling, she had a good sense of what was right and wrong. Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your father finished high school, your mother, she went up to 9th grade. Your mom didn't, how did that influence the value that they put on education?
It's interesting because it was nothing that was said over and over, but we had this expectation of going to college and finishing. And all of my cousins, and my dad came from a large family, there were 11 of them, and my mom, there were 6 of them. And all of my cousins, it seemed like a lot of us pursued college. And my dad finished high school at Robstown. I told you it was kind of funny. They're called the cotton pickers. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And he did pick cotton when he was growing up. But the story is, and I can't say that this is true, but one of his sisters told me that he was actually the valedictorian, but was not given the award because at that time, Mexicans did not, participate in those kinds, or did not receive those kinds of awards. In fact, my mom went to a school, I shared with you, and I have a picture of her class. It was called Cheston Heath High School in Corpus, and it was really the Mexican school. So they were very segregated in the schooling. Robstown wasn't at the time. That it was a different school and district altogether. But yes, so I think I think they influenced me because there was an expectation that we would go to school. That was just, and we all strived for it. And they made sure we went to Catholic schools growing up. That was a big sacrifice, even though now I thought $3 a month, that was all the tuition you paid. But that was, for them at the time, was a lot of money. So they really did expect us to go to college.
And then what was your experience at the Catholic school, and how did you guys pay for the tuition?
Well, in high school, it was a little bit higher. It was like $15 a month. And I went to Incarnate Word Academy from 9th through 12th grade. I will say that my Catholic experience, even though I complained at high school, I thought I had had enough private school and I wanted enough with uniforms, and I wanted to go to a public school. And that my parents would not have anything and would not allow that. But I really did love the experience. I had wonderful teachers, and I attributed, a lot of the things that I was successful at in my career from that background that I had. And so I remember at Incarnate Word, because it was a little more expensive and it was a little further away. It was a sacrifice to take us there. After school, we would clean the chalkboards and do other jobs around to help defray the cost of the tuition. Yeah. So.
And were you aware of were you aware that you were doing that?
Yes. Oh yeah, we were very aware that was part of it, and that was fine.
And then, so do you regret attending a private Catholic school instead of a public
No,
school?
growing up at that time, I really wanted to go to the public school because at that time in particular, it was an all-girls high school for one thing, and we wore uniforms. But I wanted to participate in tennis. I'd grown up down the street from the municipal tennis courts, and I was pretty good at it, and I wanted to participate in a tennis team, and we didn't have that yet. But in retrospect, it was worth the sacrifice of not just monetary, but having the opportunities that I did at a small school. So I don't regret it.
And do you think attending Catholic school prepared you for college in any way?
Oh yeah, I really do. I'm not saying at that time that the public school wouldn't have prepared me. We had good public schools, and that was kind of my argument. I said, well, the schools are good here. I have cousins who go, but I really did like the smaller environment, and I think the standards were pretty high. I was taught by School Sisters of Notre Dame in the elementary school, and they were very strict. They were very just excellent teachers. So I do think they gave me a good background.
And then how would you kind of describe the demographic of the Catholic school?
It was very mixed. It was interesting because the elementary, and growing up in that neighborhood that my parents had moved into and lived there till the end of their lives, and in the 1950s, it was a very integrated neighborhood. And I happened to do some research at the local library. They used to keep block by block, by hand, draftsmen would put the names of the families, people who owned each house. And I was able to get 1955 and 65, and I compared, and I could see the huge shift from the 50s to the 60s where white flight took place. So by the 1960s, it was predominantly a Mexican-American neighborhood. But when I was in elementary, it was a very mixed neighborhood. And then at Incarnate Word, because it was a central Catholic high school for girls only at that time, it became co-ed later. It drew from up throughout the cities. So I really had a unique experience of being in a very integrated school, something that we try to get now, and it's hard, you know.
Why do you think it's difficult?
Because there's still a lot of redlining, you know, segregation that goes on. A lot of it is economic, but the schools are still segregated today. You know, we made the efforts at busing in the 1960s and 70s, but we didn't achieve it, and years later, we kind of are back to many segregated schools, I think.
And how do you think like we could fix that?
It's tough. It's tough because, you know, we had forced busing and it wasn't popular. And they had found at that time that was the only way you were going to get people to go to another school is to say you must attend, you must have a certain ratio of students in these schools. I don't know that we'll ever do that again. And now we have the factor of private schools, charter schools, competing with public schools. So it's hard to answer that question because I think it's achieved in some places, but as a rule, it's not, you know.
And then, was there any sort of teacher that was kind of like a really big inspiration or acted as like a role model for you throughout your?
Yes, you know, and they were nuns. You know, I mean, by the time I got to high school, I had a lot of lay teachers. They weren't all nuns, but I had a music teacher in elementary, Sister Margaret Rose, whose real name was Pat Miller. And then the church went through a transition where nuns actually took their original name, so she became Sister Pat Miller. And I kept in touch with her years later, and she was a wonderful teacher. It got me interested in music. I played guitar, played with groups, and that's why I got involved with a group that would become really life-changing for me and have a big impact on me throughout my life. And so she was particularly, you know, important in my life. And I think just the values and, you know, I think that was important. And then in high school, I had a teacher whose name was Sister Mary Lucy Garcia, and she was actually from Brownsville. And she was a great teacher, funny. And I kept in touch with her over the years and saw her a couple of years ago, and she died last summer. And so, it was, I still think about them because they were good teachers, good role models. They were fun. They enjoyed what they did. I think influenced me to go into education as well.
Do you think your geographical location had anything to do with the type of education you were receiving?
Well, it might have if I had gone to the designated public school. Although I think the public schools in Corpus, it was mixed. You know, some of them were strong over time. Some of them have struggled. But in that particular neighborhood, I think, you know, since I was in a Catholic school, it was, I think, you know, the best education I could have gotten, because at that time, anyway. Years later, it finally closed a couple of years ago because the cost of private education is like a Catholic education. It's hard for them to maintain the schools.
And then after you attended Del Mar for 2 years, you headed off to Kingsville to attend Texas A&I.
Mm-hmm.
Corpus is kind of like around an hour from Kingsville.
Mm-hmm.
How did you commute?
Well, you know, they started, thank goodness, they started a bus system, because you have to think, you know, when you graduated from Del Mar, there was no place to go. There was a Baptist college, later became Corpus Christi State University until it finally became Texas A&M. So during that time, if you were graduating from high school or from Del Mar in the early 70s, your best option was Texas A&I, unless you went to, you know, further away. That was the closest option. So they set up a bus system, and the buses left in front of the Handy Andy store on Air Street. And it was about an hour drive. It was the 50 miles from Corpus to Kingsville. And they would leave on the hour, and they would come back starting about 1 or 2 o'clock on the hour. And so it was kind of we kind of became a community. We knew who was on the bus. Nestor and I would sit on the bus sometimes and just talk, or you do work or whatever. So actually, after a while, I didn't mind the bus ride. So I did that for 2 years.
Do you remember the types of things you guys would talk about when you were on the bus?
Some of it was what was going on in class, just discussing, But I think, too, because this was the early 70s, and there was a lot going on with, the politics of the time. Ramsey Muniz ran as governor of the Raza Unida Party in 1972, and he was from Corpus, had gone to Miller High School, school that I ended up teaching at for some years. So I think we probably must have talked a lot about politics. We did, because that was our interest in terms of our majors, too. So we did a lot of talking about that. And A&I was a big influence because it was kind of a unique place. It was very different from going from Del Mar, which was less focus on, let's say, Mexican-American culture. It was more, I don't know how to put it, but it was less involved in those kinds of trends among, the civil rights movement. We found that more in Kingsville with the professors, Dr. Bittinger, Dr. Ward. They were teaching Mexican-American history, and so it was exciting because we had not had this kind of learning where we were learning about our own borderland culture and how it had evolved in the conflicts. So I think it was an exciting period. We got very interested in our culture, and then when the Raza Unida Party came along. So it was an exciting time to be at A&I, I think.
And so when you made that transition, you were learning about all these new things, like about yourself. How did that make you feel? Had you ever had anyone ever talked to you about this stuff before? Or?
Not really. I think it really sparked, and then I had a couple of cousins that we would get together and talk about this. The cousins I was closest to, Armando Gutierrez, Luis Gutierrez, and their sister Gloria. And we would talk about these and how we would contribute or how we would be involved. And so we talked a lot of politics. I do think, though, that you asked about the Catholic school, how it influenced me. I remember when I was in the Catholic school, they came out with the papal encyclicals, the Vatican II. Came out in the 1960s, 63, 64. And as part of, I was in high school, beginning high school at that time, and we actually read the papal encyclicals, the Vatican II. And we read about, there was a lot of emphasis on social justice and primarily social justice, poverty, and the church's role in that and our role in that. And I think that influenced me a lot, And so I really became more liberal. That was my basis, I think. And then going to A&I think it really shaped me in that direction. I'd say I've been a progressive, a liberal for all my life, and I've never strayed. On the other hand, we're not a monolith. And so I know that even my family, I have everything from right-wing Republicans to liberal progressives. So, but I've always stayed on that side of the spectrum. And I think that being at A&I was a big influence in that, for me anyway.
And during that time, do you use any specific term to identify yourself? I
probably called myself a Chicana, but I always liked Mexican-American. I use Mexican-American. And that even became a conflict in families because I'd say like my parents' generation, they didn't like the word Chicano because to them it was a rebellious. They had embraced this country, and maybe they took, they saw it as being unappreciative or being rebellious and not, embracing this country. And we assimilated, we definitely assimilated, but we also were beginning to say, hey, things are not right. We need to know our history. We should be teaching this history to our high school students about what really happened, along the border and how this land was taken, what happened with the treaties, et cetera, to make us more aware. And it doesn't mean that we were going to overthrow the government or anything. We just felt like this awareness was important. And so, yeah, it was, I think that really did shape me and not just in the conversation, but in the path I took.
And do you remember any specific conversations you had with maybe your dad or your mom about how you identified and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think my dad was more political. My mom was supportive, but we would argue, why would you use that term? And it did cause conflict, and so we had healthy discussions about that. But I mean, I think in a way he was okay with it, but he didn't like it. He wouldn't use it for himself. He would called himself a Chicano. He did not like that. So but that was that generation, and that's why I say that World War II generation that had a very different experience from us who were against the Vietnam War. We grew up with the Vietnam War, and so in the late '60s we had the My Lai incident, where people were massacred by our soldiers, and then I know that we felt very strongly about the war, and we didn't have the anti-war protests that probably Austin had around UT, because we were a little more laid back, but we definitely voiced and talked about the position we took, and I had conversations with my father about that. We had different, probably different views on that. So definitely, we had those kinds of conversations.
And then going back to college, did you ever consider going to a different college?
Oh yes, I wanted to go to UT in Austin. But my parents were very conservative, and especially girls. They always got treated differently, which I think probably still happens today. But I just didn't have the freedom to go. Probably if I were male, I could have left earlier and gone to the college of my choice. And it wasn't that I didn't like A&I, it was great. But once I graduated from A&I, I wanted to go to UT. I had interest in communications, film, photography. But some of it was financial, but it was mostly you stay close to home, I got a graduate assistantship at A&I after I got my bachelor's. So I did my master's, and I lived in Kingsville for those 2 years, stopped commuting back and forth.
And while you attended Del Mar and Texas A&I, what did you major in?
It was, I was always interested in sociology, government, and, history. So the emphasis for me, I got a double major in history and government.
Do your siblings share any similar experiences in terms of receiving an education in South Texas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because we're 5 and 7 years apart. So we weren't, so I'm a little separated from them in that respect. And I think our politics over time has really, I sometimes ask, did we really grow up in the same household? Did we really go to the same schools? But, that's why I say is that our culture is very diverse. And in one family, you can have very different political views. We mostly agree, but people do change over time, and I see a tendency towards more conservatism sometimes, but among some of my relatives. But I've stayed pretty much steadfast in my position.
Do you have 2 sisters, correct? Mm-hmm. Where did they attend?
They attended the same schools. They stayed in Corpus, and they're still in Corpus. I'm in San Antonio now. I don't know that I ventured off to different places, but they have remained there.
Why did you decide to study government and history?
I don't know if it was a particular, I think what you alluded to earlier, going to Kingsville, and it was kind of very different from being in Corpus, and people were from all over the place, a lot from the valley and from different bigger cities too, and just having that interaction and having professors that were focusing on the issues of the time. And then growing up in that very tumultuous, I graduated from high school in '68 when Martin Luther King was assassinated and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and we were in Vietnam, and protests were going on, and the race riots were happening. And we were studying that in school and talking about these issues. So I think that really influenced me, and it was just an awareness that came to me, being exposed to all that.
And while you were attending these colleges, were you a part of any certain organization, club? Did you have any specific interests?
Mm-hmm. Well, I right after I got out of A&I, when I graduated in '74 with my master's, I ended up in a city planning position. So I became a city planner, and so I was really pretty much involved with work, and got married in '74. And so I was involved. I did the march to the Capitol for the United Farm Workers Union. So I participated in that way in some of the races. Participated in some of the campaigns when the Raza Unida Party was active. I did some activity with that. Did the march. But once I got into the work world and got married, I was more committed to those to that that was my life, and I did some. I can't remember right now some specific. I know I mentioned one to you. I can't remember it right offhand. I was involved also with a music group called the Abbey Singers throughout that time, and I saw that as sort of a kind of a changing organization for me, and I think it had impact on the places that we went.
Yeah, so when I was looking at your portfolio, I saw a photo of the Abbey Singers. So if you could just like tell me a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, it happened towards the end of my high school experience, and there was a person by the name of, he was a brother who was a Benedictine monk named Leo Carrillo, and we were very good friends. He started this group, and since he was a Benedictine monk, he was studying in St. Louis. And he came across a young man who was also seminarian from Guatemala named Eduardo Stein. And they became good friends. And Eduardo Stein had an unusual talent for composition. And Leo brought him to Corpus. And Leo was a great musician as well, had a lot of talent, got his doctorate in Spanish at St. Louis. And Eddie Stein got his doctorate in communications from Northwestern. And so they came and we formed this group, and we did Eddie's music. And it was wonderful music, you know. And Eddie himself had done a lot of protest music. That was, you know, sensitive music for him being in Guatemala. He had to be careful about that when he was there. But so that was, you know, that's how it got started. And it was, musically, it was a wonderful experience. We were playing music that had never been played before in Spanish and English. We produced 2 albums, one in English and one in Spanish, which are, you know, referenced in the website. And so that was a big influence on my life. And even though the group, I left the group after time because I moved away and people left, it was always has remained just very important. And I've kept up with some of the people and the path that Eddie has taken to become an important leader in Guatemala and the Organization of American States. And then Leo went on to become the head of the Mexican American Studies program here at Texas A&M Corpus. Always very active in the community and was responsible for a lot of changes in the community. And we did things like we started something called Canto al Pueblo, which was a forum for discussing the issues of the time. And so, you know, it was just a very interesting group to belong to and influence. And even though we didn't remain active in the group, so we moved away and came back, we always kept in touch, and it was interesting to see the progression of the people who had started this and who were the innovators continued to be that way throughout their lives.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you guys did songs in English and Spanish. What was your relationship with Spanish growing up?
You know, my parents spoke Spanish to each other, and, you know, they spoke Spanish all the time. They spoke Spanish to us, but I know the pattern that developed, and I think it's not an uncommon pattern, is that they wanted to be sure that we were successful. And I think for them, and you know, I think during their time period especially, but even today you see some of that still happening, where there was some negativity towards people who spoke Spanish, or even some punishment in some cases. So I think what they were trying to do as part of their World War II experience and their perspective was to make sure we learned English. And not that they didn't want us to learn Spanish, but they didn't see that that was as important as learning English. So we grew up with this pattern of, well, we heard the Spanish all the time because they spoke it to each other. They spoke it to us, but they expected us to respond in English. So I really grew up as an English speaker because of that, but listening to and hearing a lot of Spanish. So,
and then while you were at school, did you ever, like, with your friends, did you guys ever speak Spanish to each other? Or?
No, I think that particular school that I was at, it was such an integrated school, and my friends who were Mexican American, and probably half the class was Mexican, or maybe a fourth to half of the class, and even in high school, they grew up like I did, pretty much the same pattern. So English we spoke English to each other most of the time.
And then, so you had mentioned earlier that you marched with the farm workers to try to lobby for minimum wage in 1969.
I think that march was about mid-'70s. That particular march was mid-'70s.
Can you tell us how you got involved with that?
You know, I don't remember. It's just part of the whole part of being a part of the culture in the early 70s, the Raza Unida Party. You know, we probably boycotted grapes, you know. We followed Cesar Chavez in his movement in California. And Texas started to mirror that same movement. And it was more difficult always in Texas and California. It seemed to have a bigger, easier response, I guess. But here, such a big state, how do you organize a march here? But they did, and it was in segments from the valley. And it was just, by word of mouth. It was, people started talking about it, let's participate. And we always were talking about what was happening with major issues. And the farm workers were, of course, a major issue. And especially being at Kingsville in the early 70s, we talked about that a lot. And we worked, in fact, Ms. Toda and I worked with the migrant teachers and taught a class. And so we had lots of discussions about how migrants were treated and then how the farm workers were treated. So it was in segments. So we did a certain segment up to the Capitol, and there was a huge turnout, and the farm worker leader spoke to the group. And it was something I'll always remember.
Do you remember what you were wearing?
I looked at the picture, and it was probably bell bottoms or something. It looked like bell bottoms in the 70s. But yeah, it was, just, I looked like a little rebel, yeah.
Yeah, because I know there wasn't any sunscreen and stuff, and it was probably really hot.
Yeah, it was hot because I don't remember. I think it was towards the summer. Yeah, I don't remember it being tough or anything like that. It was just It wasn't like we walked for days. We did small. You could do as much or as little as you could, and that was the thing. But well, you asked me about the organization. I think I forgot to mention, now that I'm in San Antonio, I have done some work with the Esperanza Center, which is the Social Justice Center. And since film and photography were my interests, I've tended to work in those areas, provide some video or photo essays with some of those causes. The Women's March, I did a film for them, did a film for the eagle shell fracking, interviewed some of the people who were being impacted by them. So, did a photo essay for them. So that's kind of my involvement has been through my communication interests, photography and film.
And then so going back to the march, the face-off in New Braunfels, what do you remember about the meeting between Governor Connolly and the farm workers?
I don't remember the specifics. I don't really. I don't know that we talked about this before, but maybe you could clarify me a little bit more what you. I mean, I remember Connolly as governor, and that it's. That's why the farm workers were organizing, because there was so little protection in Texas, just as in California, but seemed like they were getting more done, and we saw a big need for that to happen here. And there's been some progress, but still a lot of work to be done, I think, even after all these years.
Did you want me to clarify?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so from what I know, Government Connolly didn't want the farm workers to come to the Capitol and have documentation of farm workers at the Capitol. So he met, I don't remember too much of where he met them, and there was just a really big kind of face-off. I don't know if you remember.
I don't remember that, but I will say that the march took place, and I do remember that there was some controversy, and of course they didn't want the march to happen, but it happened, and it was a pretty big turnout. The leader at the time, Orendain, I think it was Antonio Orendain, he was very dynamic. He was very much like Cesar Chavez, and people really followed him. And it wasn't a violent, or it was a peaceful march. So he didn't get his way on that, I guess.
And then looking back now, what do you make of the whole experience and situation?
Well, I'm glad I did it, because we talked a lot, and we always kind of felt like South Texas, we were a little bit out of the mainstream, there were anti-war protests going against the Vietnam War going on across the country. I know Austin had their share, but we felt like we were down there, and we just kind of missed things. It wasn't as active. So to be able to participate, and the farm workers, we felt we needed to do this because we had not maybe been as active in some of the other issues that we supported.
And then, so you just mentioned right now how sometimes you guys felt like South Texas was a little bit isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's any perceived notions people have about South Texas?
I don't know if it's what, I think they don't know what it is, you know, because Texas is so huge. They have an image of Texas, you know. They don't know, we know that they don't know the borderland very well from recent, you know, problems that we're having in terms of what to do with the border. So, no, they don't understand it. And I'm not sure if even our own perception, you know, people who live down here, we just live our lives, and it felt like we weren't being actively involved in some of the things that were happening in other parts. Some of that good, like we didn't experience the race riots of the major cities during the civil rights movement. So, you know, it was a little bit of that feeling, like we missed some of the activism that was taking place in other places.
Sorry to interrupt you. I mean,
So growing up in South Texas, where the population is majority Mexican American, did you experience, like, what was your experience with the way Anglos treated Mexican Americans?
I think the further away you get from the border, it's more marked, you know, more differences. It's more obvious, I think. Being in Corpus, it was predominantly Anglo. Very few, I think we always had less than 12% African American. So it's changing, but when I was growing up, the Anglos were the predominant group. And so I think there was more evidence of discrimination. There was less blending. There was less fluidity between the languages, like along the border. I think there's more where you see more occurrence where people speak both languages. But in Corpus, it was more divided, you know. And so, and I think there were more examples of that.
Did you personally ever experience any sort of discrimination?
Yeah, you know, I saw that with my parents and then myself. I remember my dad and mom told me that when they were looking for a house, that the real estate agent had said they were in the back seat, and I guess the real estate agents were in the front, and they said, these Mexicans are like cockroaches, they're all over the place. So my dad said, he said, stop the car, and they got out of the car. They walked. They weren't gonna, you know, they just walked out of the car, and you know, and it's kind of funny, but it's sad, but it is the kind of thing you experienced. With the neighborhood kids, you know, call you Mexicans or dirty Mexicans, things like that. And I remember we were going across Texas to California driving. And you get into West Texas and some of these little places like Junction, and we stopped, and, you know, we're sorry, but we can't serve you here. And this was the 1970s. So, yeah, it took a long time for that to change. And then once that changed, and these are some of the kinds of things we would talk about in college. You can mandate the laws, but the attitudes don't often change. So even though the law might have changed with the civil rights movement, we still experienced, you know, some of it subtle, and some of it not so subtle.
And so hearing, like, that story about your mom and dad, like, how does that make you feel?
I think that was, you know, in a way I thought, well, you know, you realize, then it made me, I knew that they realized that yes, things were better for them individually, but that these things still existed. So they were aware, you know, even though my dad and I would argue about what word to use or this or that, whether you use Chicano or not, that they understood the fight, you know, too, even though they took a different approach and we took maybe a little more rebellious approach.
And then, do you recall ever seeing any Mexican Americans in authority positions?
Well, over time, that changed a lot. I think we saw more of it. That's really kind of hard I don't remember, you know. But I think over time I began to see more, and especially as now I'm living in a city that's 65% Mexican American, or use a term Hispanic, which, by the way, I don't like that much, but because it's such a big umbrella word, you know, that I'd rather be called a Mexican American because at least, or a Chicana, because that at least identifies me geographically too, you know. So anyway, I think maybe I forgot what you were asking.
No, you're good. Going back to the march,
Mhm.
how did that march affect your thinking of the Mexican American place in Texas?
I don't know that it changed it that much. I mean, I was happy to see the involvement, and then it was always a question of like, how is this really going to change? I think, I kind of felt that the power was so entrenched. I wasn't sure that we were going to get the kinds of things that they were asking for. It improved a little bit, and I was glad to participate. But after the 70s, as we got into the 80s, we became more and more Republican. We became a Republican state. And so I've just lived through all that to know that it's very tough to change major ways that we treat a group of people like the farm workers. I'm not discouraged. I think we have to keep doing it and keep fighting for it, but it's still.
In what ways do you like? So you definitely see like there's still a lot of more progress to.
Well, yeah, I mean we've made some progress, but I think we've regressed in some ways, and so it's kind of like, it's sort of like, oh, I thought, like some way say, this isn't the country we grew up with. Sometimes we feel, my friends and I talk about comparing when we grew up in the 70s at the height of our interest in our involvement in college and our 20s, and saying somehow this doesn't feel like the country we grew up in. I think we had a lot of hope during the civil rights movement, during the 70s when we were even established a party, that we kind of felt, doesn't feel like the country we grew up in. Like it kind of became more difficult as the state changed, as the power changed, but still maintain hope. Still involved in the issues that are important.
And then how did you personally experience or witness any ethnic or economic disparity of the area?
That's kind of, you mean like in Corpus, growing up in Corpus? Or I always felt that when we were in college at that time, and the emphasis, and we had affirmative action, and it seemed like we were moving in a direction where there were more opportunities. We got out of college and there were government programs like the Community Renewal program, where I became a city planner. I went on to UT Arlington to work on my doctorate in city planning. And so I kind of felt like those opportunities were there. You could work in programs. The government was involved in trying to build cities. And then, to me, it's harder these days, I think, for students. We didn't have student debt, for one thing, student loan debt back then. But we had the challenges today, to me, are a little bit tougher. It's harder. A lot of the middle class opportunities, the government programs weren't there. Civil service has dwindled a lot. Those were pathways that we had, and somehow those aren't there as much. It's just it's different. Back then, it was just very exciting. There was a lot of movement, a lot of change. There was excitement about possibilities. And like I said, I'm not hopeless. I'm just saying that it seems to be tougher now.
And then, so you mentioned your job at or city planning, your city planning job. If you could tell me more about like the program and like how you got into that.
Well, it was called the Community Renewal program, and again, a program that doesn't exist anymore. And it was designed to help cities plan their communities. And so I was hired kind of through that program, and then once the program ended, I was hired as a city planner for the city of Corpus Christi. And I liked it. It was a lot of research. I was charged with studying the census data and looking at trends and looking at poverty in the city, et cetera, and coming up with ideas. But what I found was that Texas doesn't believe in city planning. There are no comprehensive plans. So I just kind of eventually left the field because it was a little frustrating. It was fine to do zoning and planning and that kind of planning. It was fine, but land use. But I kind of felt like the real changes what we needed to make in the communities were just not going to happen because it was driven by developers. So those were the power brokers. So I mean, it was interesting work, and I enjoyed the research, but kind of moved me into a different area.
And so you mentioned earlier that you majored in government and history.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get into education?
Well, you know, I got my certification after I got when I was getting out of school. When I finished my program, I said, you know, that might be an option, and while I'm here, I'll just go ahead and do my student teaching and get my certification. So once I decided that city planning wasn't going to be the way that I wanted to go, I started, you know, looking at education, and then I went in. I had the certification, and I was able to go ahead and step into the classroom pretty easily.
And so what was your experience being a teacher in Corpus?
I loved it because, you know, that's where it happens, in the classroom. And since I was teaching history, mostly, I taught at the secondary level, middle school and high school, I was really able to, and I actually was able to teach film and photography too, but I was really interested, it was really interesting to me to really make the students think. You know, we would have discussions and the critical thinking, I'd have them write, and I'd say, why am I doing this? Because I have to read all these papers. But, you know, it was, you know I liked it a lot. It was challenging, sure, and I saw over time changes, but always in the classroom had the kids that wanted that. They wanted to be challenged, and so I liked that. It was tough, but I liked being in the classroom.
Do you think your experience at Texas A&I and Del Mar kind of shaped you in a way to like become a teacher?
I think so. If I look at some of the teachers I had, even at Del Mar, I had some, you know, and it was more of a liberal arts approach there, and then more specific to history and government at A&I. Definitely, you know, Dr. Bittinger and just several teachers that I had that were talking these issues that we had never talked about before. We're finding out about our history and the government in ways that we hadn't learned before. So yeah, it definitely was a big influence.
I remember Nestor talked about Dr. Bittinger for a while. What was your relationship with him?
Well, he was a sociology teacher, so I had a class from him, and he was I didn't end up being in that department, so Nestor probably spent more time with him, but I was working with him with the migrant teachers, and he was just one of these professors that was so, he had a peacefulness about him and an approach that was so open and opened our eyes to a lot of things in a very subtle way too. It wasn't like he was pounding it on the table about, you know, or he didn't force his views on you, but he just exposed you in ways that just opened your eyes, and you realized that you were seeing some things that you had never seen before. He was just a really good teacher, exposed us to a lot of that.
So what was like your approach to teaching?
Well, I liked developing my own, I mean, I followed the curriculum and what we had to teach and all that, but I always made more work for myself because I taught almost, even if I taught the same course 2 or 3 times a day, I always approached, depending on the class, you know, but I really wanted the students to be challenged. I wanted them to really, I guess critical thinking was my interest, you know, to get them not to agree with me. I didn't care if that, you know, and I didn't really, I'm not sure they really knew where I stood on these things, but I wanted them to be able to share their thoughts and share it in a, you know, write it, speak it, dialogue in the classroom. So that was a lot of my approach.
And then what were the demographics of your classes?
It varied. Like, you know, if I was, when I was at Carroll High School, it was very mixed. When I went to Miller, it was the oldest high school. It was predominantly Mexican American. So, you know, it just varied. I taught at a couple of middle schools and a couple of high schools in Corpus before I went into administration. So it just depended. You know, I had everything. And my student teaching experience was I went into a classroom, there were 70 students, and I had a microphone that had to talk to 70 7th graders, if you can imagine. So, you know, it was like, I got baptized pretty quick on that. But it was a good experience. Each class different, you know.
And were you like a role model to any of these students, the way that like these other professors were to you?
I don't know. You know, you always hope. It's not something you can say, oh, I want to be a role model, I'm going to do this. It has to happen just because of the person you are and how you treat the students. And you hope that you're having, that you're helping them. You know, your goal can't be that I want to be a role model to them. I think the goal has to be I want to be the best teacher I can and hopefully help them to discover for themselves, you know, who they are and how to extend their learning in really good ways. So, and it's funny because I was going through the pictures, I came across a few student pictures. They'd write something on the back, and I thought, wow, that was really a sweet thing they said. I didn't realize, you know, they felt that way or this or that. And so, yeah, you forget kind of, but it is. I've had some students will express that to you, and it's really nice because you hope that you can have an influence on their life. But you don't always know. Mm-hmm.
And then, so did you only teach were you only involved in education in Corpus, or did you go anywhere else?
I taught in Dallas for about 4 or 5 years, and that was at a Catholic high school. It was very different. I loved it, though. And then I went to Portland and taught. I didn't teach there. I was involved in a program there as an administrator. Yeah.
Was it Portland, Oregon?
Yes, Portland, Oregon.
And then, so how was that whole experience? Like, what made you decide to go to Portland?
You know, the opportunity was there. I had spent all my years in South Texas, mostly Corpus, and I just saw it as an opportunity to do something different. Extend, you know, could some of the success we had at Miller High School, for example, in turning the school around, could that be replicated someplace else? So I liked the challenge of going someplace else and seeing, you know, what could be done.
Yeah, so
And living in another part of the country, beautiful part of the country.
So when you were working as an administrator in Portland, Oregon, in like 2005, 2011?
Yeah, around that time.
Did it ever make you think back to your schooling in South Texas?
I felt prepared, and I felt like when I left CCISD, Corpus Christi Independent School District, I was an administrator. I was working at central office as an administrative officer for secondary education. So I dealt with all the schools and all that stuff, and they did a lot of good training, you know. And I had a very good supervisor, probably another person who influenced my life a lot, Dr. Tony McCoy. She's still in Corpus, and so through that experience, I had a lot of great training. So when I went to Portland, I found that not only had my teaching experience been equal, but also my administrative experience. I had gained a lot from that I could share, and I wasn't out of place, or we weren't inferior. We were up on technology. We were using the things that other parts of the country were using, even more so. So in that way, it was kind of, it was revealing. It was good.
How did your experiences in the Valley shape you as a teacher and prepare you for that?
I didn't really teach in the, oh, you mean it like, what do you mean the Valley?
Or South Texas.
South Texas,
Yeah,
okay.
Corpus.
Or just say it one more time.
Yeah, how did your experiences growing up in Corpus Christi shape you as a teacher?
Oh, you know, probably the good teachers that I had probably shaped me more. And I thought, you know, that's the kind of teacher I want to be. One that challenges you and opens your eyes, and you feel like you've really learned something, and you want to go beyond that and find out more. I've always, my friend, the supervisor that I mentioned, she calls me the investigator and the researcher. So I'm always going beyond. I have to look this up. I have to find this. I have to, you know, get to the bottom of this. So I think that's what kind of motivated me to do that.
Have you ever been outside of Texas before working in Portland?
No, you know, Dallas, that was, you know, Texas is so big. Dallas is so, that part of the country, of the state is so different. So that was a very different experience. I had traveled to the West Coast a lot because I have family there. My grandparents ended up there, and my aunts and uncles. But no, I hadn't worked outside of the state until then.
Yeah, and then so I remember when I spoke to you over the phone, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, going back to your parents,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned they were a part of Mr. and Mrs. Club. Can you explain a little bit what that
It's
is?
kind of interesting growing up, and I, you know, and like you asked about Corpus and the discrimination. I think the Mexican American, especially those who were striving middle class and achieving middle class, they developed some of their own mechanisms that were available. You know, the junior league was a very elitist white group. Well, then the Mexican Americans in Corpus started a group called the Mr. and Mrs. Club. I don't know how it started, but I know that by the time I came around, my parents were involved in this club, and it was a social club. And it was a great thing. All these families got together at Easter, and they had celebrations and almost like coming out parties for the when you turned 15 and stuff like that. So it was very dynamic, I think, in a way. They kind of developed their own cultural activities and organizations to mirror what was happening in the Anglo culture, which they weren't a part of, and at that time wouldn't be a part of. So it was interesting. It wasn't really political at all. It was mostly social, but it was definitely just a Mexican American families, and I would say a lot of them were, middle class. And I think it still exists.
Yeah, and so going back to South Texas as a whole, what do you think were some factors that contributed or continue to contribute to the disparity and inequality of the region?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think part of it is Corpus has remained sort of a resort community. They depend on the service industry. There isn't a lot of technology. It's not like Austin. It's interesting because if I looked back at the census in 1950 and 1960, and if you look at Austin and Corpus at those times, their populations weren't that different. And then you see how from 1960 to the present, Austin has just grown enormously and become a center of technology and diverse occupations and jobs, et cetera. In Corpus, we have now we have the four-year university. That used to be the reason. They say, well, we don't have a four-year university, so kids go off someplace else. But what happens is they still go after they graduate from high school or graduate from Del Mar, and maybe they even go to A&M Corpus. But many of them end up moving to the larger cities. So I don't know. Corpus has tended to remain more of a laid-back resort kind of culture. And so I think that prevents the big, we don't have the Dell technologies, we don't have, Apple or those big technology groups. It's more based on the port, oil. The school district is one of the largest employers. The base is there, but that doesn't grow. So, it's kind of difficult to get to. We used to be the headquarters for HEB. HEB started there. They were from there. Whataburger started there. The families were from there. And they moved their central headquarters to San Antonio or to, other big cities. So Corpus is kind of out of the way, and it just hasn't developed. And many people are happy with that. Some would say that Corpus doesn't grow, doesn't provide the diverse and the economic growth because the old guard would like to keep it that way. So I think it's a little bit, there's a mixture of reasons why it doesn't happen.
And then so the South Texas Border Initiative, how do you think that impacted the area, like bringing in more PhDs and like four-year universities?
So so when you're talking about the Border Initiative, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, so the South Texas Border Initiative was like a lot of people just kind of worked together to implement like a better education, like for college and stuff in South Texas. And that's like when you get like Texas A&M, Corpus Christi and stuff like that. How do you think that has affected the area?
Well, I think it's definitely helped, because even Del Mar, a lot of people thought, well, this is going to hurt Texas A&I to build a four-year university because, I would have probably gone to school here and not there if the four-year university had been available here. But it's interesting that A&I has continued to remain strong. Del Mar is adding a whole new campus on another side of town. We're getting ready to build that. The population hasn't grown tremendously. It's stayed in the 300,000, 350,000. I mean, depends on how you look, how much area you include. But I do think that this university becoming part of the A&M system, for a time we didn't know if it was going to become part of UT or part of A&M system. It ended up A&M system. But providing that four-year university, and people come from other places here, and it's grown So I think that's good. I think eventually, hopefully, it will help that more of them will stay here once they graduate, and there'll be more opportunities, economic opportunities for them here.
Yeah, so you worked in education for quite a while.
Mhm.
How do you think your thinking has evolved over the years?
You know, I'm always a learner. It's something I've learned. Like people say, gosh, aren't you bored that you're retired? And I said, no. You know, I'm always reading, I'm writing, I'm trying to learn something all the time. So I think I've always just loved learning. I've always loved school. Pursued a doctorate, didn't finish because I moved back here, and that's okay. I didn't pursue almost finished the doctorate in city planning, but I decided to shift to education. So, so I think I've always been a lifelong learner, and I think that's helped me. And that makes me feel alive, you know, to do these things. I do some. You asked me about organizations. Right now, I belong to an organization where we do voter registration, and so to me, it's part of like taking what I've learned and at least giving students I do voter registration with students in high school in San Antonio. And so I get them to at least be aware of what the process is and then the opportunity, you know. And it gives me a chance to be around students again, too, not in a teaching position, but at least to help them with something. So, like I said, politically, I've become more steadfast in my views, you know, and I keep up with all of the issues because I love it. I love politics, and I love keeping up with that. So, you know, I have stayed. I haven't all of a sudden become a Republican. I never did that. I've stayed pretty, not that I just support someone because of their party, but I look at the person individually, and I've remained you know, I guess I'd say progressive liberal, although I hate labels, but that's, I guess if you were going to put me on the spectrum, that's where I am.
Yeah, and so when I had talked to you previously, you said that you weren't never really committed to like the Raza Unida party. Why was that?
It wasn't that I wasn't committed. I supported it, but I wasn't, you know, it was active in some cities more than others. So if you were in Austin or in San Antonio, it was probably, you know, my cousin was involved in the party. So I don't know, maybe you misunderstood me. I did support it 100%, and I supported the party and all that. It just wasn't around that long. You know, it seemed like the height of it was 1972, and I was at college. And I certainly supported Ramsey and that. But I kind of saw the writing on the wall. I didn't think, even though he had gotten a couple of 100,000 votes, I just thought, I didn't think we would ever win the top positions in that party. And so what was going to be the most effective way to make changes is to try to get at least the major party, to get some of those good candidates in the major party, and hopefully that would happen. So, no, I did support it. I just thought it was a huge mountain to climb to be able to have a Raza Unida candidate win the governorship, you know.
And why do you think it was really difficult?
Well, look, you know, this last election, we came so close to having a Democrat win a state Senate position. It's because the state is so huge, and the rural vote tends to be conservative and Republican. And we made great gains, but because of the way the districts are drawn, one district is drawn, goes from El Paso to San Antonio, and in the governorship, you know, it's changing, but it's very hard to win the vote, to move to a Democratic governor in the state. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
What is something you feel is important to share with someone who might watch this interview?
I don't know, really. It's just, I think it's just my story, how I've evolved. You know, it's how we each, what paths we take in our life. So I think for me to be committed to just doing what I think is right. Hopefully I've helped students along the way when I taught or when I was administrator. My goal was always to make an impact, to do the right thing, and hopefully have some positive impacts, you know, and not for personal gain or recognition. So that's not why I would do this, to somehow say, oh, look, I'm important, I did this. No, it's just, this is my story, and maybe it has some meaning. I had a student ask me on Friday when I was doing registration a couple of days ago, said, what is my purpose in life? And he was talking to me, and I said, you know, I didn't know he was because I just walked into this classroom one day, and I said, you know, son, I ask myself that question every day. I said, so, you know, I think the important thing is that you're asking the question. That's really good. So if you keep asking that question, I think that you'll find meaning. And so for me, it's kind of like that's been my drive. This is teaching, going into administration, now in retirement, what I do, remaining a learner, helping where I can with, you know, with students getting registered to vote or whatever. It's my purpose, you know, and I hope that it has some good impact along the way. And that you can remain true to your values and true to who you are, and hopefully that is, on my children and my grandchildren, I hope that I can be that help, you know, for them.